Well, good evening, cohort number 4. It is good to be with you this evening. We are hours away from Thanksgiving, and I wanted to get this in before tomorrow. So happy Turkey Day early. My research topic was on the state of current New Testament scholarship's interaction with the recent models of biblical Hebrew poetry. Obviously, we've had a lot of influence in that regard, and by the grace of the professor, he has allowed me to use this as a stepping point into possible dissertation research. And so we're going to dive into that and see how New Testament scholars kept up with recent models of biblical Hebrew poetry. Have they applied those principles? So let's find out. State of the question and the methodology. This is good to get up front how I approach this subject, and it's not all that difficult to figure out, but I still wanted to be upfront with how I approach this. The Simply put, has New Testament scholarship kept up with modern models of biblical Hebrew poetry? And as we'll come to find out, they have woefully not kept up. They have done a poor job, as we will see. That arises from that is, how does one assess whether New Testament scholarship has kept up? And so we will delve into that in my paper, is kind of what I do in that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the assumptions that we make at the beginning that I don't have time to flesh out, but the assumption is that the New Testament has poetry, and secondly, that it is in some way related to or modeled after biblical Hebrew poetry. I'm going to start with those assumptions. If this were a dissertation, this would be part of my methodology. And there's a lot of other assumptions that would have to be stated as well, like Septuagint and things like that. But just so that's stated out front, you know where I'm coming from. So the way I dive into this approach is I use the International Standard Version, not a very popular translation, but because David Allen Black was one of the New Testament editors, it has some influence, especially because he's written in a couple different articles about how to translate New Testament poetry. And the ISV brings this out very, very well. And you can Google the ISV New Testament poetry, and you'll get a lot of great examples of this. But one of the ones that I think is a good example that I'll use as an illustration later is 2 Timothy 2. They translate, "In dying with Christ, true life we gain, enduring we with him shall reign. Who him denies, he will disclaim. Our faith may fail, his never wanes. For thus he is, he cannot change." Now, this doesn't grasp necessarily the biblical Hebrew poetry model, but it does communicate to the English readers, at least, that there is some form of poetry going on in the text. And so I use that as a jumping off point to say that there is something happening in the text that we need to be aware of and reckon with, and likely it would be biblical Hebrew poetry using models from Psalms and other poems and forms of verse. Coming back to the state of the question methodology, how would one assess whether New Testament scholarship has kept up with modern models of biblical Hebrew poetry? Well, I came up with an idea that would try to cover as much as possible within the limited range of time and resources and abilities. So here's my model. I am picking 4 New Testament poems from 4 different authors, as we'll see in a second. I want to examine at least 10 scholarly commentaries written in the 21st century, or at least within the last 20 years, by various viewpoints. So whether it be Catholic, Protestant, German, liberal, I might have tried to get some French translations in there, and various forms of evangelical scholarship. And, oops, that was one too many. I try to favor the more technical ones, not so much the pastoral and the homiletical ones, just so you know where that's going. I will definitely note which say nothing about biblical Hebrew poetry. I will note the ones that are still using the old Lothian categories of synonymous parallelisms, antithetical parallelism, and synthetic parallelism, and note any that use Kugel or Alter. Spoiler alert, nobody does. So I kind of gave away my whole point. But you'll see how it gets good. So that's kind of the methodology I'm going with. Again, it could be refined. I would like to do more German scholarship, but I'm having a hard time tracking down 21st century commentaries that I can even evaluate. Thankfully, there have been some that have been translated into English that were not only written in the 21st century, but later translated in the 21st century. So that was helpful. So the four passages I'm using, I'll give you a good idea. I'm using the Lord's Prayer from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, the Magnificat in Luke 1, the trustworthy statement in 2 Timothy 2 that we looked at previously, and then John's poem in 1 John 2. And we'll come back to 1 John 2 later as well. But I picked these four because they're four different authors. Lord's Prayer and the Magnificat, they both come from the Synoptics, but the Magnificat at least is unique and has been examined quite extensively as far as Hebrew poetry is concerned. And I want to do one of the more obscure passages from Paul. The Carmen Christi in Philippians 2 would have been an easier choice, but I wanted something a little bit less notoriety. And then I wanted to give 1 John 2 a chance, verses 12 through 14. So we'll come back to that, see the benefit of that process. So I want to just deal with the Lord's Prayer and really the first three phrases in the Lord's Prayer, because that really shows the sharpening of the Kugel-Alter approach, the focusing effect. And so the commentaries I picked, you'll see they cover a broad range of views, and they're presented here in ascending order. We start with Nolan in the NIGTC commentary. Gibbs, this one is looks like a very dense commentary that I've not been able to track down. It's a harder one to come across. France, obviously, is well known. Turner, and these are well-known commentary series. Luz, well, that's however you say that. This is an interesting one, the SIL translation series, only on the Sermon on the Mount, so it's very focused, and I had fun picking at them. Keener has various iterations of his commentary, but this is the most recent version of it. Then the late great Grant Osborne, who recently passed away, used his Zondervan Exegetical series from Charles Quarles, who is now at Southeastern, his book. Scott McKnight, and again, these are a couple of just focus on the Sermon on the Mount. And John Pennington, my professor. And finally, this one wasn't so much academic, but it does give a good perspective of just other views out, or just another approach. And especially since it just did come out in 2018, I thought it'd be good to have on there. I almost used, I wanted a Catholic one on here. However, the ones that have been done in the 21st century, I had a hard time finding any. So it's kind of limited in that respect. To move forward, I wanted to establish ahead of time that it is not unique that I would consider the Sermon on the Mount, or excuse me, the Lord's Prayer, as poetry. These are very recent articles published, at least the top two there, about the Lord's Prayer being very poetic. In fact, that top one by Martin is a fantastic article, just going through all the poetic devices. And the things that he points out there, I don't find difficult to see. I think he's pointing out things that are almost obvious. If you can read it in Greek, you can see the rhythmic patterns. And so one of the things that I think will set apart New Testament poetry is that it can do some of the same things as biblical Hebrew poetry, but it can also do other things such as meter and rhyming and other Greek rhetorical things that Hebrew poetry never did. And so that will be one of the tricky things to flesh out, is how does that reflect in New Testament poetry? It's not all of biblical Hebrew poetry. It seems like it's bringing in other elements. So whip out your Greek New Testament, and you can see what I'm talking about, especially with the rhythmic and the rhyming. Not to say that Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme, but that's not what it's known for. So the Lord's Prayer is highly poetic, and it's well recognized. So just wanted to throw that out there as we begin. In my research, what I found, at least with the Lord's Prayer, most commentaries that I cited, that I showed you before, They're more focused on the world behind the text, and they wanted to compare it to other prayers of very similar wording, something about anything like the Aramaic Kaddish prayer that had to do with hallowing God's name, using very similar language. That was definitely a lot of the emphasis behind many commentaries. The technical commentaries, especially the commentaries that dabble in form criticism and redaction criticism, they would spend a lot of time on this. And I was limited, or I limited myself for this paper for 21st century research. However, just going back to, since the time of Kugel and Alter in the early 80s on, that was what a lot of people get caught up in with the Lord's Prayer. So I did not get a lot of help in the commentaries that I mentioned. And again, I wanted to be very objective in this, so I didn't know what to expect when I picked these. But many of them wanted to look at the world behind the text rather than the literary world in the text. Now, where they would make interpretive conclusions based on the literary structure of the text, they would merely assert, say, these things are stated in such a way that they all mean the same thing, they're all referring to the same thing. They wouldn't give any rationale or proof for that. And the point of the paper isn't to say that their interpretive conclusions are right or wrong. It's simply to note, and at least my contention is that they could have at least backed it up with some kind of proof. If they were using Loath's categories or other biblical Hebrew poetry categories, at least they could have used something to assert their claim. So I'll give you a few examples of what they said. France commented that the third phrase, the third of these clauses builds on the second. So your will be done builds on the second, your kingdom come. Keener said that the hallowing of God's name, the consummation of his reign, and the doing of his will are all variant versions of the same end-time promise. Nolan claimed that the third petition encompasses the scope of the first two, unifying their respective present and future orientations by focusing on the common central thread. Turner said that the three your requests should be understood as three ways of asking for essentially the same thing. Since the three your petitions are essentially one, the final phrase of Matthew 6:10, on earth as it is in heaven, describes all of them, not just the third. And so while they may or may not be right, the point is that they're not backing their claims up. They're simply asserting, because the structure appears to me this way, therefore it means this. So this is where the benefits of applying the models of biblical Hebrew poetry, and again, if you're for Loath or against Loath, for Kugel, against Kugel, at least give you some kind of grounding to base your conclusion. There were two exceptions, and when I say exceptions, they actually address Hebrew parallelism by name. So we see in Tehan and Abernathy, a good example, they speak of the Lord's Prayer in typical Hebrew parallelism. The second petition explains the first, which means that God's kingdom is a society upon earth where God's will is done as perfectly as it is done in heaven. Then Brown and Roberts, using Jewish poetic parallelism, the prayers ask for essentially one thing, that the kingdom would arrive, expressed in three complementary and expanding ways. So interesting that they're using these kind of categories. So the pay dirt, if we are to move the conversation forward, what example or what is the benefit of using biblical Hebrew poetry? I wanted to mention this in the article, the paper, and I used 1 John 12 through 14. I got the idea when we read through Ben Witherington's book. He mentioned Dwayne Watson, a couple articles on this, and the third article there, or the third source there, really focuses in on the passage and its rhetorical effect. But I disagree. I think he offers views that could be answered easily with biblical Hebrew poetry, not with rhetorical criticism. So if you look at the text, this is what we're dealing with, and we don't have time to go through it. I wish we did, because I'm coming up on 15 minutes. But it follows the patterns of what we'd expect with Hebrew poetry. Not all commentators agree that it's poetic. Some will call it hymnic. Some don't call it anything. But many do see it as poetic. And so there are issues to face. Are there one, two, or three different groups? Why is the second half largely a repetition of the first? Why does the tense change from present to aorist? Lastly, how does this function in its context? The first three are easily answered with biblical Hebrew poetry, with the variation between children, fathers, and young men, which I would not take chronologically. I think the biblical Hebrew poetry model would help focus down or sharpen down to strength. You're not as strong as a child, but when you're an older man, you're stronger, but not as strong. But when you're a young man, that's when you're at your strongest. So it's that sharpening, that focusing. Why, or of which is largely repetition of the first. Why is there the repetition there, the first half of the second half? Well, that's biblical Hebrew poetry. That's the parallelism there. And the tense shift is easily explained, especially when you look at Adele Berlin and what she has to say on this issue. So in conclusion, I want to make the following observations. Well, first of all, I'm pessimistic of New Testament scholarship's use of the recent advances in biblical Hebrew poetry. Most are still following Lowe's categories or not citing Hebrew poetry at all, and not many have used Kugel or Alter. I've only come across a few occasions, and even on those occasions, they reject the approach of Kugel and Alter. So I am pessimistic on New Testament scholars and their interacting with Old Testament scholarship, first of all. I'm cautiously optimistic of the interpretive benefits of those advances, and I say cautiously optimistic because New Testament poetry can do more than biblical Hebrew poetry just because it's a different language and even perhaps from a different cultural mindset, especially for the Gentile world. But other matters I'm going to have to deal with in the dissertation. Things like the New Testament writers of Jesus, would they have used biblical Hebrew poetry? Um, so, Paul, John, Matthew, Luke, would they have been using biblical Hebrew poetry? What would a New Testament author need in order to make use of biblical Hebrew poetry in Greek? So what kind of worldview, what kind of background would he need? Does the Septuagint affect that? And if so, does the Septuagint demonstrate an awareness of biblical Hebrew poetry? The A, what is more, B? And would the Septuagint play a part in the New Testament's use of poetry? Is New Testament poetry limited to biblical Hebrew poetry, or going to go beyond that to Greek poetry? So there's quite a bit to flesh out there for a chapter on methodology and discovery. So I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and God bless.